You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Well, hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole, coming at you from that cesspool otherwise known as LA back in the 90s. And I am just one of your hosts, Matthew Rushing, and with me, I'm just so glad to have her back, is Christy Morris. Christy, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, thank you. At first, I was wondering if you were talking about the 602 Club as the cesspool, and I was like, geez.
No,
that's not how I feel.
No, we clean this place regularly.
Let's be honest with ourselves here.
New York, no, and LA, neither of those get cleaned up. That's why everybody wants to escape from them. But as you heard, the dulcet tones of none other than John Mills. How's it going, John?
You know what? I'm excited to talk about this strictly because it closes out the Lethal Weapon arc, the journey that we've all been on together.
Yep.
And I already know going in, I can just sense it. There's going to be some disagreement on air. And I love it.
Right.
I love it. I live for this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not too old for this.
Absolutely could be. But we're excited to be talking about Lethal Weapon 4 to kind of round out that series for all of you. But of course, just a reminder, wherever you are, if you're listening to the show, please do subscribe. Let people know that you like us too by sharing us on social media. We're at the 602 Club on X or at the 602 Club TFM over on Instagram. You can also find the entire network on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We've got the listeners only discussion group there as well that you can find, called the Babel Conference. And you can find our website at trek.fm, where you can see all of the different shows that we are doing each and every week. And of course, you can also find us over at Patreon. If you like what we do and want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of our team. So the last time we talked about the series, we were in the mid-90s, and the third film was a success. And interestingly enough, they immediately start talking about the idea of, wanting to go and do a fourth film. In fact, they talk about the idea of doing the fourth and fifth film. And so they work on this script. And of course, this movie doesn't come out until 1998. And so this is an incredibly arduous process to get this film to screen. It takes multiple writers, many rewrites, and they legit don't have a finished script by the time they even start filming this. And so I just wanted to ask both of you, as we're coming into this, we're rewatching it, as you rewatch it, do you get that sense as you're watching the film that, like, this is a movie where it didn't necessarily know where it was going from start to finish because they didn't know where they were going from start to finish? What do you think?
Yes. This is a blender movie. This is we got some concepts, let's make it work. You were talking about how they were trying to work on two at the same time. It's interesting to me because that echoes Richard Donner's Superman experience, where they were we're going to make two movies at one time, sort of thing. So obviously that's just in his blood. And, I mean, the connective tissue with this it's a little weak. Like, it's a series of events more than a story.
I think that's a good point. I would agree with that somewhat. Maybe not quite as much, but definitely that there's parts where you're thinking, okay, these are loosely related, but there could be better overall consistency in the storytelling to weave it all together better. But I mean, I think that it does seem to have a couple of big points that they stick with, and I like I said, don't feel quite as badly about that.
It was interesting to rewatch the movie and it's been a long time, honestly, since I've seen this series in general and the fourth one, and to learn that was the case, I wasn't surprised when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
But in all honesty, it's interesting because I do feel like all of these films are kind of stories based around a friendship. And so the connective tissue for all of the stories isn't necessarily, except I think for the very first one, always incredibly strong, because it does feel like more like days in the lives of these cops, where crazy things just seem to happen to them every single day, right? And this movie felt like I would say the second and the third in that sense. And so I wasn't really experiencing, I didn't feel like a major frustration with it in that sense, where I'm like, what is going on? And how does this all connect? In the same way, I feel like it was the second one where I maybe felt like that, where I was just like, there wasn't not enough connective tissue, if I remember correctly, where it was just like feeling like the storyline was just not doing it necessarily for me. And I don't feel personally like that with this film. I feel like it holds together well enough, and I'm the story itself, I felt like it feels relatively cohesive for the most part. And again, to me, the hallmark of this series really is that it's just about these two guys and what's going on in their lives at this moment that we find them in. And I still, for all intents and purposes, I think that kind of still works for me in this movie. I don't really sense a massive frustration with like, oh my gosh, what were these guys thinking? And why does this movie not seem to connect at all?
Just to offer the counter to that, it suffers from too many characters. I think that a good script rewrite, obviously they had plenty of them, but refining it down and maybe cutting a couple of characters and focusing things so that, Renee Russo's barely in the movie, so there's no like real payoff for her being with Riggs in that sense. Leo Getz is there just because it's Joe Pesci and everybody likes Leo. And it's like, he serves a purpose, ? Yeah, Chris Rock come in just because he's the hot guy. And then, they go into the whole shtick with him and Joe Pesci in the police station. And it's like, okay. This is sort of them riffing. And it's like, that's what I mean by a blender movie, because there are all of these ideas that are unrefined that are just thrown together.
And see, I didn't feel it was as much like too many characters as there were occasionally scenes that could have just been edited out and the movie would have been exactly the same. Like, I don't think you needed the dentist scene at all.
No, you didn't.
Or the scene with Joe Pesci and Chris Rock talking about cell phones.
Yes.
Irrelevant to the rest of what's going on.
Well, although the cell phone discussion is truly a beautiful time capsule for when you had to pay by the minute and everything. Yeah. And it's like, who knew that it would make you feel so old to say, oh yeah, I remember when that happened. It's like, oh no.
And how Chris Rock is even joking about using a rotary phone.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I was like, this doesn't really hold up as like a, timeless thing.
That, my gosh, maybe they should make a Lethal Weapon 5 just so that we can see somebody riff about smartphones being dumb.
Or they'll say, look it up in the phone book.
Yeah, something like that. Oh my gosh. Ugh.
I think that I'm somewhere kind of around both of you in that sense, that I do think that there are places where the film could have been edited down and some of the scenes taken out. But it is pretty clear, I think for the movie, this is something, we'll talk about, adding a new cast member specifically with Chris Rock a little bit later. But, Leo wasn't supposed to be in the movie for the longest time, and neither was Chris Rock's character. And they become rewrites, and they're basically shoving them into the film. And I think there are definitely places where you can see that being the case. And it almost felt like, too, where Donner is just allowing these characters to kind of be on screen and maybe they like some of their improvisations and then they move forward with that. But, it's interesting because when I was reading about how much of a problem the behind the scenes were with the film, I was actually just surprised in the sense that the movie turns out as well as it does with as badly as things were going behind the scenes. I mean, when you start a film and you literally don't know how the movie's going to end, you expect it to be an utter train wreck. And I maybe I'm showing my hand, but I don't think this movie's anywhere close to an utter train wreck. I mean, I've seen way worse movies than this that had full scripts from the start, So like, I don't really see that as being a main deterrent, but I do see it being a place where, there's this is one of those places where a little bit more refinement in every single area would only have benefited the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think the movie benefits, in all honesty. I mean, obviously, the chemistry between Gibson and Glover and everything, but Donner, has had such a career by this point that there are things that look really polished. And this is specifically a movie he's done 3 times before. So it's a lot easier for him to plug in. And there are scenes where, I mean, I believe in my heart of hearts, I could look at it and be like reshoot scene or insert scene, because the lighting keys, they have that slightly different quality about them. But then you look at, just in the opening, there's real polish to that. And it's because it's an opening that they've done before. So it's like, okay, look, we know how to handle this. So I think the movie benefits from that. And so you're right that it's not a complete disaster. I think that it's tipping my hand too, I guess. I think that it's better than its reputation, but a lot of the criticisms that are heaped upon it, I completely understand.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, speaking of the big opening, John, I mean, they love doing this where they have, these massive set piece openings happening where we just kind of throw you in with the action. And, this one, they're going against Napalm Iron Man, which was an interesting choice. For both of you, what do you think of this as kind of opening this movie and kind of in some ways, they also set up some of the actual thematic elements that we're going to be playing with both of these characters in this, ridiculous scene.
I mean, I think it obviously is a consistent choice this time with sticking with the way the other films have been introduced every time. So I thought it was fine for that. Obviously, the type of character you're going with here for them to fight against is a little far-fetched. We don't usually see something to that level. And I definitely said, oh, it's Boba Fett with a flamethrower. But it was fun. And I especially loved the scene that I forgot about as part of that whole opening of him asking Murtaugh to take off all his clothes and flap his arms like a chicken. So yes. I love it.
I think as a standalone set piece, it works. It absolutely does. I mean, and this is the old pros coming back. They know what they're doing here. And it's like in less capable hands, the scene doesn't play well, but it's edited tightly. It moves. It's got humor. It's got character exposition flawlessly delivered. We've got all of this stuff. We're basically brought up to speed on all of these sorts of things in such a concise amount of time that honestly, it's a great opening. Yes, it's far-fetched the way they open. And I think that's just inevitable because with sequels, bigger is better. But also, and I might be attributing too much to this. This is also after that stellar gunfight sequence in Heat has blown people's minds open as to what's capable. And I don't think that this is a direct one-to-one reaction to it, but I think that this is a product of once Michael Mann shows sort of how you can do this sort of like absurd, gunfight sort of thing. I think people start stepping up to the plate with it.
Oh yeah, that would make sense. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I actually forgot that the movie opened like this. It's been so long since I've seen this one that I just totally forgot. And, it seemed like it reminded me in a lot of ways of those 90s superhero movies and the type of scenes that you would get in those. And so, and especially because we have this guy in armor with a flamethrower and everything, and he feels like a villain from a comic book movie. And it's just out there and ridiculous and wacky enough for you to feel like, does this just happen in LA every other day? So it's, I think the thing that makes it work though is, Christy, you mentioned the gag with, getting Glover to get down into his underwear and flap his arms like a chicken and all, and the laughs that are happening back and forth. But it's also, like you were talking about, John, that the whole point of these films is the relationship between these two characters. And both of them, learning that they're either going to be a grandfather or a father in this scene is so great. Because it also, one of the things that I think that happens in this film, and, in some ways there's some real recognition that we're moving forward in time with these characters. They're both getting older. Their lives are changing. And in a lot of ways, it reminds me of a much more humorous type of thing that you do in Star Trek 2, right? Where you're acknowledging characters are getting older and they're having to come to grips with that reality. And, things around them are all changing. And so specifically for Riggs, Lorna being pregnant, Murtaugh going to be a grandfather, Rhiann having a baby, him not knowing she's married, all this type of stuff, Riggs just realizing he's not the young guy he used to be anymore. He's getting older. He can't do what he used to be able to do. Like, all of this, and partly I think it works even better now watching it for me because, I'm that person where so much in life is changing. I'm getting older. I can't do what I used to be able to do. I mean, this is I think this is just a theme that it's so easy to resonate with, especially the older you get.
I wouldn't take that away. I think that Murtaugh has always been sort of that character, I'm getting too old for this S sort of thing. I think advancing Riggs into the same category as what is intended to make it resonate more. Like, Riggs is now acknowledging mortality and the passage of time. And that's just another reason why I wish there had been a bit more focus to the script so that we could have spent more time with Riggs going through that. Because, you go back to the first one, it's his emotional arc set against Murtaugh's that really makes that film sing. And it would have been nice for that to find more of an echo here by having more focus on the two of them. And not just, it's even if you just take Leo Getz out of the boat scene and give them the opportunity to be alone on that boat scene without Leo interjecting, that boat scene is instantly better. And it's just one of those things where it's like, because Leo has those punctuation points where he's going to shoot the shark and then he's talking to the newscaster and stuff like that. It's like, further evidence of, I see what they were going for, but it didn't quite get there, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I did want to call out that I like, as far as them moving forward with their lives and everything, what you brought up, Matt, about how the two of them talking in the opening scene about being a first-time father and grandfather also informs how they might do their jobs differently at this point, because suddenly they realize they've got even more to live for. Not only is it their spouses or, for Murtaugh, his kids, but now he's got a new baby and is going to be a grandfather and wants to be around for that. And then Riggs is grappling with, do I go ahead and get married even though I'm not sure that I'm ready? And, now I'm also a first-time dad. So I think that also casts this new light on how they're going to behave in the future, because they want to make sure they get through it.
Yeah, I think the one thing that, and this is a part of the troubled production issue is that because this movie doesn't take place, maybe a year and a half after the original film or the third film, I think that in some ways you do lose a little bit of something because the Riggs storyline of, you can tell everybody's older, right? And very clearly older. And so for Riggs to still be struggling with, the choice between moving on, getting married again, all of those things, it still works. But I think it would have worked better if they could have found a way to do this movie 3 years before this, and that's just not something you can change about this. But I think the storyline, just specifically for the character, John, I appreciate you calling it out, and I agree with you in that sense that, that part for Riggs is the emotional center to his character, right? And we've really watched him kind of grow and move forward. The fact that he even, got into a relationship in the first place in the third one. And, now it's that big question of, oh gosh, do we get married? We're having a kid together, and am I ready to move on? It's like there is a disconnect that they can't do anything about, I think, because of that, this is, 1998 instead of like 1995 or maybe even 1994. You would hope this movie could probably have come out. So, but I like the fact that they're doing that for these characters and moving them forward. And, it really is, when these movies are at their best, it's when it's really focusing on these two characters. And so again, John, I agree with you in the sense that, if that boat sequence just had those two guys in it without Leo, I think it's a much better sequence as well. And then Leo can come in later, because there are points in the story where he kind of is helping them with the investigation and all. It makes more sense for him to be there. But this is for both of those guys where their daughter and or, their partner is close to being pregnant, it would make much more sense for them to be kind of out on the town, or, out on the boat one last night before it's like, we can't really do that because, they could go in labor at any moment. And I can't imagine them bringing Leo to that. As much as you kind of like Leo, he's not the kind of guy you're bringing when you're just like wanting to hang out with your best buddy, So,
and have a chill, quiet time.
Yeah. Quiet being the operative word. Oh, man. Well, you brought it up earlier, John, but, we get the new cast member in Chris Rock as Butters and making him Rianne's baby daddy and husband. And, he was actually meant originally when he first showed up in the script to be a new character that was actually gay, and they just didn't feel like it was working, so they kind of turned that into the way that Riggs is making fun of Murtaugh and getting under his skin, knowing what he knows that Murtaugh doesn't, and so how does he work for you? Do you like him in the role? Do you like him in the movie? Or do you feel like he just takes away from too many things?
This is a younger, hungrier Chris Rock, thrilled to have the opportunity to be in a big budget blockbuster as his star is on the rise. And in terms of everything else, I just don't think the character is particularly successful because he doesn't have a chance to be.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that you can definitely tell that he is, as an actor, going for it a little too hard, I guess I would say. Especially that they left in the scene about the phones and everything. And I have to say another point that this doesn't age well. It just feels uncomfortable, even though they decided not to make Butters' character gay. The constant joke about it, like at Murtaugh's expense or with Murtaugh constantly thinking that Butters is like hitting on him. I think they just take it a little too far to where you're like, if I was gay and I was watching this movie, would this make me offended?
Yeah, I definitely see what you're saying there. For me, I would come at it more from the standpoint that it's just not a funny joke. Like, regardless of anything else, it's like it's
right.
not funny. And so the fact that they linger on it, that's what really gets annoying, because it's like, okay, it's like somebody telling the same joke over and over again when like the most they got out of the first time was like, huh. It's
right.
like, oh, okay, you can lay off that joke now. It's not working. So, yeah.
You know, I think more than you two, I find the character successful, but not completely. In the sense that I think that, like the Leo character, I think there are a couple places where Donner needed to step in and be like, Chris, I like what you're doing there, but we need it to be shorter. Mm-hmm. You know, we need you to get to the punchline quicker in that speech you're making, you know, and a lot of this, I mean, there are places where I just feel like Chris Rock is doing his shtick, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that works in the movie. Like I kind of enjoy, and I always have, that first one where he's like, oh yeah, that's how this guy wanted to arrive in America, in the killing section, you know, like that whole speech I find to be very funny, honestly. But the one in the car, when they're driving, it's like, this is set up as a shot just to have Chris Rock riff for a minute and a half and, you know, let him say whatever he wants to say that's funny and that's vaguely a part of the script. And so there are just places where I feel like it could have been more successful. I also think that instead of having the joke that you're talking about run so long, I feel like it just would have been much better to have them tell Murtaugh earlier that this is his son-in-law and let them get to that point faster so that you can start to kind of build things in that sense. Because I enjoy as Murtaugh kind of warms to Butters as a person and, you know, accepting him as his son-in-law and all. And I think that would have been much more interesting to see that progression be able to work a little bit more slowly and even more organically by allowing that to have more time rather than just kind of dragging out this joke like you guys are talking about that isn't necessarily even that funny. Like, it's just kind of like, okay, you know, whatever. That's
if you feel compelled to have the Butters character, I agree with you. Reveal the son-in-law thing earlier, and then, even though it's something of a trope, you can find comedy in Glover being overprotective and trying to keep him out of the action because he wants to protect his daughter's husband. And then you can even have funny moments where Riggs is like, you never watched over me like that. You just let me run in. You know, like that would have been a funny scene where it's like, why are you protecting him? You never protected me. And it's like, oh, you're a grown man. Like it would have just like sort of written itself, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know. I just think they just didn't really know what to do with him, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there were moments that were good. I mean, I don't want to discount that. You know, I think that I did enjoy the car scene, actually. And I like when they finally have their moment after the dentist scene happens and they walk outside, when Murtaugh kind of comes to and he's like, but we need to talk about this. Like, wait a minute. You just sat in there. And I have to say, I loved the joke when Riggs initially said, your son-in-law, and then made it about enforcement.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. There's some good stuff that comes from that whole sequence of playing, you know, that Riggs knows and Murtaugh doesn't. And I like all that, you know. Again, I think as we're just kind of coming down to this, it's quite obvious that you really need a rewrite of the script to polish all this stuff. And I do think that these are the places where you can see, we don't know where we're going. And so therefore, it doesn't work quite as well as it could if somebody knew exactly where we were going and puts a nice polish on everything. And figures out what needs to be there, what doesn't need to be there, and all of that stuff. And so I was really interested in this because I was thinking back, at this, we had just had in 97, Tomorrow Never Dies, where the main villains are, the tech mogul and working with the Chinese government. Then of course having the switch over with Hong Kong being a big part of that. And so then in this film, also using the Chinese connection, and having, then a huge action star just really blowing up the scene, Jet Li coming on, and, the whole thing with the triad members and the counterfeit money that they're making and, all of that. I'm really interested to hear from you guys. We've got all these different types of villains going on in these films, and I wanted to know how y'all felt about, this villain storyline that's kind of driving and underpinning everything that's happening to Riggs and Murtaugh and their families for the film.
So I think that it could have been better. I will say, I thought that it was interesting that it went this route, especially in light of what you're saying, Matt, about Tomorrow Never Dies coming out the year prior and having a similar kind of thing with the villains being Chinese and things. And this one, although that idea is a good one, I think that the initial introduction of Uncle Benny and of Jet Li as Hua Sing-ku, it just could have been more detailed, I guess I would say. I think that they just don't give you enough initial background about Jet Li's character specifically to make him seem so formidable of a villain to fight until you actually see him fight later. But the idea about using the counterfeit money and the, human trafficking that they're involved in and things like that is actually interesting and something that could possibly happen. But I think that they needed to make them more, have more of a punch from the get-go.
I agree. I think they could have gotten there by cutting Uncle Benny and just having Jet Li as the main back. He's just there, like he shows up on the scene, however you want to get him on the scene. And spending more time with him, because by the time they seem to figure out what they want to do with the character, it's too late in the film for it to really gel properly. And I think that Jet Li is such a charismatic actor. Yeah, obviously, he became a star overseas and he became a star here simply because the guy, he's got that vibe, right? Comes across on screen. But just like the Riggs and Murtaugh thing, there's just not enough time with him. There's so much going on that by the time you get to him, like it just feels crammed in. And it again emphasizes that whole idea of like, well, if I cut a couple of things and got to him faster and maybe gave him a little more room in the script, it lands a lot better.
I honestly, this is actually one of my favorite parts of the movie. So maybe I'm just in a different place than both of you, but I really enjoy, and I know I was looking at some things about when the movie come out and all, and that, people kind of called out, they felt like these were kind of weak villains or whatever, but I found them to be actually really terrifying and more, and in some ways much more realistic than some of the other villains that we had in the film, maybe even I think of the third film, because this felt really like something that could happen, right? When it comes to the underworld of the Chinese triad, and the type of things that they're involved in, we'll talk about in a minute with the human trafficking and all, I think is 100% even more relevant, it seems like today than ever. And so that's the thing I found incredibly interesting about this. And I think, Jet Li, he doesn't even have to say anything. It's just, the action sequences that you can film with him because of what he can do are incredible. I mean, still, I find to this day, the scene where he disarms both of them and takes apart Murtaugh's gun at the same time is astounding. Like, it's just great work, and so, and even that last fight sequence, between him and Riggs and Murtaugh, things that he's able to do, the way he's able to move are just astounding as well. And so I find him to be an incredibly scary villain. And, on top of that, you have him and his people willing to literally kill him when he's like, in Hong Kong, you would be dead. And then he goes to burn down their house and them inside. I find that to be pretty terrifying, and so to me, he's actually one of, maybe even since the first film, I find him and this storyline to be the most interesting of all of them, because it's not as over the top as some of the other ones have been. And yet it seems incredibly realistic that these are the type of things that happen. I think of real world events that have just happened, like, having somebody's house get blown up in Maryland, right?
Virginia. Actually, right near where I used to live in Virginia. Woohoo!
Yeah. So, things like that. It's just, again, I think they're great. And I do find it very interesting too, because I think this is in some ways somewhat of a time capsule to be, the way in which, the world is reacting to, China now having Hong Kong as a protectorate, and considering it part of China, and the world's reaction to that, and, those type of things. So this is in some ways an interesting time capsule for that. This is also, I think, before, Hollywood was so hell-bent on having the Chinese box office audience, and so they were willing to make movies that, didn't make any bones about the things that actually do happen in China. So I find that to be all really, really interesting. So I guess for me, this works better than it did for both of you. So,
well, I acknowledge, like, the whole human trafficking thing, that makes sense. That's the type of thing Riggs and Murtaugh are going to go after. Like, my gripes really sit, again, too many characters and just not getting to Jet Li and giving him more screen time. So it's like, I don't discount anything you're saying. Obviously, it's the post, Hong Kong handover angst that is informing a lot of things. But yeah, it's a frustrating sort of thing in the sense that, like, I'm not disagreeing with you about what they're trying to say. Like, it seems like such a quibbling little discussion for me to be like, yeah, well, I just didn't like how they put it together. And it's like, I get it. I know I'm probably coming off, to some people.
Sure. No. And I don't think so, because I get what you're saying too. I think, and what I hear you saying is that it works, but you see and you can sense how it could have been much better if you had just reworked some things. And, you get where they're going for. It's just not as successful as you felt like it could have been, which I think that's actually, we talk about that type of stuff here on the show all the time. And I think it's a valid criticism, right? And again, it's another place where the film suffers from them not knowing exactly where they're going and not knowing even where they're going to end. So, and this is one of the places where, with those relevant issues we were talking about, specifically with the human trafficking, I absolutely wish this was a place where the movie dove into this even more, because I really like how, and Christy, you were saying this even on our outline, the way that this touches Murtaugh, the idea of the human trafficking, which leads to slavery for many of these people. And it's still an incredibly relevant issue when you think of the ways in which human trafficking are leading to sex slavery for so many, especially children. And it's sad that it's even more relevant now, it seems like, than it was back then, or at least just maybe we just didn't hear about it enough. But I thought that's a place where the film really could have leaned into that storyline much more, and it could have been incredibly powerful, especially, again, with the connection you have with Murtaugh being an African-American man, and why he feels so strongly about this.
Yeah, I felt like that's probably my the thing I feel that is the strongest character point in the whole movie, because it ties these other pieces together, and because it's crossing these lines of different ethnic backgrounds or classes in society, and drawing you to the conclusion again of everyone having the human experience and that we all deserve certain things. And so I love that it focused on how Murtaugh could still see similarities between himself and these people and took them in, because he's like, I know that it's illegal and yet I couldn't just leave them. Mm-hmm. And that's why I thought it was so great that he uses the quote, that's so ingrained in American history. It's bring me your tired, your poor, and your huddled masses. And reflects so well on how he feels, being someone that obviously didn't experience slavery, but he can look back and say, I wish someone could have done something better to stop it sooner. And I feel like this is the one little thing I can do now.
Yeah, it's a great story point to connect with Murtaugh. And just like so many other things, I sound like a broken record. I wish I'd had more of it. There's only so much you're going to get, but I think that Glover, his scene where he's connecting with the patriarch of the Hong family, where they sit down and he's like, "Oh, you've never had tequila before?" And they sit down. That I think additionally operates on a layer of something that's always been thematically there with these movies, about the fact that we're all the same inside, sort of thing. That like Murtaugh can relate to this guy just as a human being, because human beings are human beings. And it's like you strip away all the pretense and everything, and it's just two guys sitting in a living room having a drink. Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's a very relatable thing. And I think it's it's a good message. You always have to applaud Donner for the times when he sticks to his guns and makes sure that those things land, which again, I think gets back to, even though the script isn't finished, even though I have all of these problems, this is, a set of old pros who know what they're doing here. And so they can still get that scene out of this movie, because when they showed up that day, it really feels like they're like, you know what? We got this. We know what this one is.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things where I think that the whole storyline, the whole series has really been about family, and the way in which Murtaugh and his family have adopted Riggs, right? And he's become part of their family, and that has created a healing process in Riggs that's allowed him to create his own family now. And I absolutely love too, and I think it was actually an incredibly powerful scene, I thought, at the end of the movie, where Leo is talking to Riggs, in the graveyard, and he's telling him this story that at first seems kind of silly, but you realize he's doing it to connect with him and to let him know, look, I know that I'm obnoxious, I know that I'm annoying, and yet it's y'all's acceptance of me that has made me be able to feel like I do have a family, like I do have friends, and helping, Riggs realize that he can move on, because it's not about comparison. It's never going to be the same. It's always going to be different, but that's not a bad thing. It's okay. And I just thought that scene was so great, and I think it really just encapsulates, in all honesty, what makes this series work so well in general, is when you're really focused on characters and them connecting with one another, and it's such a natural scene because it actually just shows the progression of these characters' lives and how they've impacted one another. And so, like, the whole thing to me, is great. And I really loved all of it. And, also very glad we did not get Danny Glover in a bathtub again. So that was actually great. But again, the family stuff here really works. And of course, the movie ends with it being all about the family, because it's about the larger family of the people who've been making these movies together, for so long. And you can really sense that, like, this is a crew, this is a cast that is all incredibly comfortable with one another and loves one another. And I think all of that just comes across on screen, and it's genuine. It's so authentic. And I think that's the thing, that even this movie isn't perfect, or maybe it's not even great, right? But there's something about it that just kind of, I think, draws you in, because everybody really, it's real, it's genuine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, too, that you hit on a big aspect there, Matt, of them taking moments throughout the film to really focus on those big character beats, where they're allowing the moment to kind of breathe and pause and focus on it and not just brush past things. And I think you get that specifically in the graveyard scene, and then also between, like you mentioned, John, Murtaugh and the patriarch of the Hungs talking together, because you need that. You need these elements that tie it back to why we're here, that we're talking about the human experience, or that we're talking about getting older, and then about family. And those are the big themes, I would say, I guess, that override all the movies.
Yeah, the cemetery scene comes out of nowhere, in all honesty. Like, it's one of those things where, not to overhype the guy or anything like that, but like, that's where Joe Pesci pays off.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's the moment where you're like, okay, that's why Joe Pesci's in the movie, is because he can deliver that scene. I just wish I hadn't had to wade through everything leading up to this. I wish they could have found another way to have him involved in some capacity, because that is actually a really touching sort of monologue for him to give. And, it obviously works. And it's just another one of those things where it's like, like you're saying, Chrissy, it's a moment that's allowed to breathe. And it's like, it's just, if you cram less in the movie, then more of those scenes can happen. There can be more breath throughout all of these sorts of things and these discussions and moments you have in there. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested to see what you guys think of this aspect, because, we have a lot of action sequences in this movie from start to finish. And many of them are big, I think right from the start, you've got the big one, and then you've got the boat sequence that happens, and then you've got a massive car chase sequence in this film, and then you've got the finale, you've got the fight in the house. What did you guys think of the action in this film? Because it really does, regardless of whether or not that, they've got a full script together, it feels like they went go big or go home with a lot of these action sequences.
Yeah, I obviously we already talked about the opening one. It's your Lethal Weapon 3 revisit, bomb. They get a chance to blow something up, so they're like, okay, let's blow this up. And it's absurd, but it's fun. I'm going to sound weird here. I like the fight in the house. I like, other action moments. The ending feels indulgent. That last fight feels indulgent. And it is something where maybe there's somebody yelling at their speakers right now because I've spoken some heresy, but it's one of those moments where I think the lack of a finished script exposes itself, because they're shooting a lot of final fight. And yes, your big climactic fight and everything like that should be big, should be a showstopper, should be a curtain call. But at the same time, there's just sort of this thing where it gets a little, the only way I can say it is like Jet Li gets a little too Terminator-y at the end. where it's like Murtaugh gets him with the rebar, and then they keep fighting, and then they go in the water, and it's like, for a movie that started with a guy in a flame suit and a flamethrower and an exploding gas station, somehow after Jet Li gets the rebar shoved through him, and then Riggs takes him, and I'm like, oh, he's gonna throw him, and oh, they fell through, and and he's shooting him. Like, once they go in the water, it's like, okay, yes, I like that Murtaugh comes down and rescues him, obviously, but that's sort of the moment where it's like, once they go in the water is sort of where I tune out. And that's where I think they just went bridge too far with it.
And I can see that. I mean, definitely, I agree with your assessment, John, about Jet Li's character just going on for too long. I definitely recall saying at one point out loud, the guy just won't die. Yeah. It was a little much going to the water as well. And I think that you could say that it was a little overindulgent even just from the get-go, with Riggs and Murtaugh seeming to have a mutual plan in mind, but they're leading up to it as if they aren't prepared.
Yeah.
That went on a little too long for me.
Yes.
But I will still say, for me, that was my favorite action scene of the entire movie, because in between those moments, the style of the fight was so grounded and gross sometimes, with the fact of, the way that Jet Li looked like he was holding Mel Gibson's throat in that one part. And then Gibson pushing on Jet Li's eye. I mean, I was gripping my hands together because it was uncomfortable to watch. Even though it's not real, you're just kind of thinking that would feel terrible.
Yes, it's not something friends do with each other.
No.
That is very true. Yeah.
Yes. Thank God. I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle with you guys. I don't think that it
Come on,
needed
Matt,
to
pick a side. Pick a side.
I just I don't know. I mean, I think for the most part it works for me. I don't really have an issue with it, but I can see the point of, once you go into the water and it just feels like, okay. But I think the thing that makes it work for me with going into the water, like you were talking about, John, is having Murtaugh save Riggs, and so much of this series, it feels like they kind of go back and forth and saving one another. And it feels nice to just have this one end basically with, the old guy saving the younger guy, and, it being about their connection, and so, yeah, I think, and that, I mean, gosh, that car sequence chase is just insane.
Yeah.
Where they crash into the building and then they drive through the building and then they go out the other side. And I mean, that type of stuff is just insane. The fact that we used to do that in films, we don't do that stuff anymore.
Fast
I don't feel
Furious.
like, for the most part. Yes, the Fast and Furious took on that mantle. But I think for the most part, the action stuff here is, like you said, John, these are old pros. And they're back at work, and they know how to make it work. And I think for the most part, these action sequences work because of it. And it also just helps that you're gripped because of you've got Glover and you've got Gibson, and you care about those two characters and what's happening to them on screen. They've made you care because of who they are and the way they act towards one another. And so, yeah, I mean, I really, I think it works for the most part. So, in all honesty, I can't wait to see where both of you are going to come down then for ratings for Lethal Weapon 4. So, John, where are you going with this one?
Well, I land firmly in the didn't hate it camp, but also didn't particularly enjoy revisiting it camp. It's very much a movie where when I rewatch it this time, I go, yeah, there's sort of a reason why mentally I sort of stop at 3 and then I have to be reminded that 4 exists, because for all of the craft that goes into it and for the winning moments, it's a little too And so I wind up giving it a very, I become the villain now. This is a 2.
I wouldn't call you the villain.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I think that everybody's points are valid. And I think that it has some things here to like, but I understand where the criticism is coming from. For me, I enjoyed it a little bit more. I think that because there are those saving moments of taking a beat and focusing on something important for a little longer. And also, I really loved the scene at the end with, even though Rene Russo isn't in the movie much, the wedding in the hospital. And then it's to the point where they're not Jewish and they've got a rabbi doing it and they're not actually getting married because they don't have a marriage license, but she wants to hear the words before the baby is here. It was cute. And that even though, I would say Riggs and Murtaugh kind of disagreed at this point about what values they hold with marriage. Maybe Murtaugh doesn't, obviously, but Riggs is like second guessing everything. I think that's an important aspect that they're bringing into this of there can be people that have babies together that don't necessarily get married, and that's okay. So I like all of these pieces that together may not have the greatest connective story arcs, but I think are still good. So I end up a little bit higher and give this a 3.5 out of 5 because I think there's still a lot to enjoy, even though there's some things I would criticize. So would watch again.
I like being simpatico with Christy and giving this a 3.5. I actually enjoy this movie for all its faults. It's one that I really liked rewatching. It's one I've always liked, and it just confirmed that I continue to like it. In all honesty, to me, the series is 1, 3, and 4. I like to forget that 2 exists sometimes. I would rather watch this than 2 any day. And so I think that's where it comes down for me. It's kind of almost like, the Indiana Jones question: would you watch Temple of Doom or Crystal Skull? And I'd probably more likely watch Crystal Skull than I would Temple of Doom. So that's kind of where I land with this. And
now Matt's the villain.
And
yes, all of the heat is taken off of me for my 2-star rating.
Yeah, you can come at me anytime. That's what X is for. But so yeah, I mean, I'm glad that we got a chance to finish out the series. Super fun. We got we got one more show for sure this year for you, and then depending on when we can fit it in, we'll have Rebel Moon coming out, and John and I will be talking about that with crossover with Snyder Cuts and the 602 Club. But before we get there, John, where can everybody find you if they want to talk about, maybe where you should have more love for this film or just anything else going on?
You can find me online as Kessel Junkie, KESSELJUNKIE, and you can find me over on the Nerd Party, hosting 2 shows, House Lights and Aggressive Negotiations, a Star Wars podcast.
Well, thank you for joining us again, John. Glad that you could be here to cover everything. And then I also wanted to add in, you can find me, of course, at Bespin Bell on Instagram, X, Letterboxd. And then if you want to talk to me in the Babel Conference on Facebook. And I hope you'll check out my finished podcast I did with my friends Amanda and Teresa called Sabers and Spells on the Skywalking Through Neverland Network. And what about you, Matt?
Well, you can find me all over the place under Matt Rushing02 on social media. You can also, of course, find me here on the network outside the 602 Club with Literary Treks, The Orb, Warp 5, The Artificial Tango, and Saddle Up. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, when I'm not talking with John on Aggressive Negotiations, you could find me on Owlpost with Dre Kaufman. I always talk about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. But thank you so much for joining us.
And y'all come back now, you hear?
Bye.